3500 BCE. No pyramids. They won't show up for another few centuries. Stonehenge, still in beta, just a few lonely stones poking out of the earth. The rest of humanity, hunkered in scattered villages, knee-deep in the Neolithic. And in Siberia, mammoths are still very much alive. This was a world barely out of the Stone Age, a world without empires, without metal tools, without writing, or so it seems. Because suddenly, in a dusty patch of land between two rivers, something starts happening. Fast. Not just buildings, but cities. Not just counting, but accounting. Not just storytelling, but writing. Someone, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to milk goats, was inventing civilization from scratch. They passed laws, they had taxes, they built temples that scraped the sky and mapped constellations with shocking accuracy. They even filed written complaints about bad customer service. We call them the Sumerians, and to this day, no one really knows where they came from, how they learned all this, or why, after thousands of years of being ahead of everyone, they suddenly vanished. Some say gods taught them, others say aliens. But as it turns out, the truth is even stranger than that. So let's dig into the mysteries of Sumerians, strip away ancient myths and modern misconceptions, and look at what's actually left behind. They show up out of nowhere. One day it's just scattered tribes along a river, and then suddenly there's writing, architecture, bureaucracy. It's like someone hit fast forward on civilization. At least that's the common misconception. In reality, the Sumerians didn't appear out of thin air. They settled in southern Mesopotamia somewhere around 5000 BCE, and archaeologists actually trace the gradual shift from scattered farming communities to more complex urban centers. But here's the real mystery. Even as their cities grew and their ziggurats rose, no one knows where they came from before that. Sumerians called themselves Sangiga, or black-headed people. Sadly, no indication of their origins here, but their language itself offers a significant clue. You see, Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it's not related to anything, not to Semitic tongues like Akkadian or Hebrew, not to Indo-European roots like Sanskrit or Latin, not even to the neighboring Elamite. It stands completely alone, with no known parent, no descendants, and no linguistic cousins, like someone just invented it specifically for Sumerians. And that's where the speculation begins. For some people, the fact that their language has no known ancestry is more than enough to connect the dots all the way to, you guessed it, Atlantis. Call it what you want, but it's the lost high-tech culture wiped off the map. Then its remnants scattered around the globe by sea, rebuilding what they could in a world that had forgotten everything. Sumerians are just the earliest and luckiest example. And to be fair, there is at least some ground for such an extraordinary claim. One of their oldest myths speaks of a being named Oannes, a creature part man, part fish, that came from the sea. But he didn't conquer or destroy, he taught. He showed the Sumerians how to write, how to build, how to live in cities. Oannes brought them knowledge, and when the sun set, he slipped back beneath the waves. Ancient astronaut theorists point to Oannes as a possible extraterrestrial. Others think he's a distorted memory of survivors from a sunken land, a nod to Atlantean origins. But let's not lose ourselves in the sea of outrageous claims based on pure mythology, cause there's another much more plausible theory. Some researchers believe the myth of Oannes may indeed hold a real memory, not of Atlantis, but of a sea-based migration, specifically from the east. There are intriguing parallels between early Mesopotamian and Indian cultures in myth, mathematics, urban design. The idea is that before the rise of Sumer, there may have been a coastal civilization in what is now the Indian subcontinent, perhaps even a pre-Harappan culture that traveled west by sea, settled in the Fertile Crescent, and sparked the development of Sumerian society. The language isolate? Perhaps we just didn't find linguistic ancestors of Sumerians in India because they couldn't write. So, in the end, the Oannes myth still holds true, but with no Atlantis required. Mainstream scholars still place the Sumerians' origin closer to home, probably from the Zagros Mountains just to the east, migrants from highland farming societies who gradually settled the river plains and developed new technologies as they adapted to the land. The Oannes story, completely made up, just like most origin myths, but deeply symbolic for their authors in the ways we won't see now. But you don't need a myth to get some wild Sumerian exaggerations. Imagine finding a document that claims a single king ruled for 28,800 years, another 36,000. And this isn't from some fringe cult or doomsday blog. It's a stone tablet baked into the history of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Welcome to the Sumerian King List. It's exactly what it sounds like, a list of rulers stretching back into the mists of time. But it doesn't start with anything modest, like Bob, who ruled for a decade. It begins with gods, with kings whose reigns lasted longer than the entirety of recorded human history. And it says plainly, then the kingship descended from heaven. That line itself, 5 words, launched 1,000 conspiracy theories. Enter the Anunnaki. In Sumerian mythology, they were the divine council, powerful gods who came from the sky to shape the world, rule over humans, and pass judgment. But in the 20th century, someone decided that wasn't dramatic enough. His name was Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin wasn't a historian or a linguist, but that didn't stop him. He claimed to have decoded ancient Mesopotamian texts, revealing that the Anunnaki weren't just gods. They were ancient astronauts, beings from a mysterious rogue planet called Nibiru that swings into Earth's orbit every 3,600 years. According to his theory, these extraterrestrials genetically engineered Homo sapiens by mixing their own DNA with primitive humans to create a labor force for mining gold. Yes, gold, to somehow save their own planet of certain doom, or to make a ton of alien jewelry. It's either this or that one. Still, this space Anunnaki claims stuck. They became the darlings of ancient alien YouTube, late-night cable shows, and Reddit threads. Every Sumerian statue was scrutinized for space helmets and wristwatches, because if you squint hard enough, anything can look like a gadget. Well, I hate to break it to you, but real scholars, the ones who can actually read Sumerian, have debunked Sitchin's translations over and over. He mistranslated key words, misunderstood grammar, and often just made things up wholesale. The Anunnaki were never described as coming from another planet. They were gods, yes, but gods in the traditional sense, symbols of nature, authority, chaos, fertility, not space invaders with a mining quota. As for the king list, it's not a spreadsheet of literal history. It's a mix of myth, political propaganda, and religious storytelling. Ancient rulers often exaggerated their lineage to appear godlike, to borrow divine legitimacy, or to link themselves to the legendary past. It's no different than medieval kings claiming descent from Hercules or dragons. But Let's be honest, city managers that wanted to go down in history as gods doesn't go viral nearly as fast as gold-hungry aliens running a slave operation from Planet X. But even after all the debunking of Sitchin's claims, lots of his followers still believe the truth about Sumerian alien overlords is still out there. Because to this day, there are over 500,000 clay tablets that are still untranslated. That sounds wild. These tablets are written in cuneiform, the world's oldest known system of writing. Wedges pressed into clay, baked in the sun, and scattered across ancient Mesopotamia. Some sit in museums, some lie in boxes in university basements. Many haven't even been touched since the day they were dug up. And that silence makes people wonder, what's in those tablets? Why haven't they been translated? Are they hiding something? Secret histories, lost technologies, a warning we're not ready for? If you've spent even 5 minutes in a conspiracy forum, you've seen the theories, ancient nuclear wars, alien contact logs, even blueprints for anti-gravity engines, all conveniently buried under layers of bureaucracy and academic gatekeeping. Right. But do you know what is one of the most common phrases found so far on the tablets which were translated? 2 lambs, delivered. And that's exactly why Sumerian came up with cuneiform in the first place. Civilization requires documentation, and a lot of it. Receipts, contracts, invoices, tax records, and so on. And it's quite safe to assume that untranslated tablets contain not the wild secret alien stuff, but just this more of cattle delivery orders. Also, you have to keep in mind that cuneiform translation is slow. You need trained specialists who can decipher a dead language, interpret a damaged tablet, and place it in context. And there are only so many people who can do that. We've only scratched the surface because it takes time, not because there's some global effort to keep humanity in the dark. But maybe, just maybe, somewhere in that mountain of contracts and tax forms, there is indeed something remarkable. Not a spaceship schematic, but a story, a name, a voice we haven't heard in 5,000 years, whispering something we didn't expect. In fact, one of the cuneiform documents has already rewritten history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written, includes a very peculiar tale. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the gods about a coming flood. He builds a boat. He brings animals aboard. The flood comes. The world is washed clean. And afterward, a promise, a new beginning. Sound familiar? It should, because this version was written 1,000 years before the book of Genesis, with Noah being the epic sailor who saved mankind and all relevant animals. And this great flood plot that echoes in many ancient cultures makes people believe it's not a myth, but a cultural memory of a real cataclysm. Asteroid impacts, pole shifts, and so on. Some say it wasn't just a natural disaster, but a cosmic one. Maybe the Anunnaki pressed the reset button to do a controlled purge. Sumerians were only the first ones to talk about it out loud. But let's take a step back from cool sci-fi plots and consider this. Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians lived, wasn't just prone to flooding, it was defined by it. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers brought life, but they also brought chaos. Entire cities could be wiped out overnight by a flood that came without warning. Archaeologists have found thick layers of silt in Sumerian ruins, flood deposits. From that data, only we can infer that some floods covered most of the Sumerian populated areas, so that the survivors on boats wouldn't be able to spot even a little island up to the horizon. And considering that Sumerians thought Mesopotamia is essentially the whole world, here's your Great Flood. So maybe the flood in Gilgamesh wasn't about divine wrath or alien resets. Maybe it was about remembering, encoding a warning of a real catastrophe into a story so it wouldn't be forgotten. And perhaps it was told so well that other cultures borrowed it for themselves, without second thoughts. But in some Sumerian cities, there were structures that still stood above even the highest water. Ziggurats, towering platforms of stone and brick stacked like stairways to the gods. To the ancient Mesopotamians, these weren't just buildings. They were sacred mountains, artificial peaks meant to bridge earth and the heavens. The name itself hints at their purpose, Zikkuratu, to rise high. A later myth, the Tower of Babel, tells of humanity united under one language, building a tower to reach heaven. The gods, threatened by this ambition, scatter the people and scramble their tongues. It's a tale of hubris, punishment, and divine control, and it sounds suspiciously like a distorted echo of real ziggurats, particularly Etemenanki, the one in Babylon itself, a structure so massive it likely inspired the whole myth. But not only that one. According to some modern interpretations, ziggurats weren't temples, they were launch pads or stargates, or energy antennas designed to communicate with extraterrestrials. The idea is simple. Any structure built to reach the heavens must have been built for something coming from the heavens. The steps, a landing grid. The shrine at the top, a docking station. And to be fair, it's easy to see why the theories took off. Ziggurats look otherworldly, symmetrical, geometric, imposing. Standing at their base, you'd feel small. According to estimates based on ancient texts, Etemenanki stood over 90 meters tall, roughly the height of the Statue of Liberty. And that's with no steel, no cranes, no modern reinforcements. So that must have been aliens who taught Sumerians how to build that high, right? The thing is, even if some kind Anunnaki overlords shared the exact technology to produce metal frameworks, the builders wouldn't be able to apply it since Mesopotamia has no significant metal deposits. What Sumerians did have was mud brick, thousands upon thousands of them, sun-dried and stacked with precision. The core of the ziggurat was usually made from these bricks, while the outer layers used kiln-fired bricks for extra durability. They used bitumen, a naturally occurring tar, as mortar, waterproofing, and even adhesive. Massive ramps were built to haul materials to higher levels, and drainage systems were integrated to keep the whole thing from collapsing in the rain. In the end, Sumerians organically engineered ziggurats from what they could do in their region. Ziggurats weren't meant to send anyone into the sky. They were designed to bring the sky down, to invite the gods into sacred space. The name Etemenanki means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. In fact, atop each ziggurat was a temple where priests performed rituals, where smoke rose in spirals, where the divine and human could meet symbolically. So it wasn't launchpad technology at this point, just good old theology. And from the tops of their ziggurats, priests weren't scanning the skies for incoming spacecraft. They were doing something much harder, tracking patterns, watching stars rise and fall, charting the wandering lights we now call planets. They were practicing astronomy long before the word astronomy existed, and the results were genuinely mind-blowing. The Sumerians were already working with a lunar calendar, dividing the year into months based on the moon's phases. They identified and tracked Venus, noting its strange retrograde motion across the sky with such precision that their observations would remain unmatched for millennia. in some cases outperforming medieval European astronomy by over 1,000 years. Sumerians also categorized constellations, some of which, like Leo or Taurus, still live on in our modern zodiac. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Sumerian math is something you've used today without even thinking about it. The number 60, as in 60 seconds, 60 minutes, a full circle with 360 degrees. That's not random, it's Sumerian base. 60 mathematics, a system elegant enough to survive thousands of years, still ticking inside every clock. So naturally, someone had to say they didn't invent it themselves. Here we go with Anunnaki yet again. Ancient aliens who arrived not just to mine gold, but to drop off astronomy textbooks before vanishing into the cosmos. But you don't need all this sci-fi to explain the simple truth. You see, due to the whole civilization thing going on, the Sumerian priests didn't have to grow food. They paid farmers for that. So these ancient scholars just had plenty of free time to watch the sky. Their region had perfect conditions for stargazing, clear skies, flat horizons, and a culture obsessed with timing the rituals just right. The stars weren't just decoration, they were part of the cosmic order, sacred, measurable, and tied to everything from agriculture to politics. And still, without modern telescopes, Sumerians couldn't see past Saturn to detect Uranus and Neptune. You'd think alien overlords from Nibiru would mention these tiny ice giants, but no. So the Sumerians didn't need help from space. They had math, mud brick, and time, and they used all three better than anyone else for 1,000 years. But even brilliance has a limit, and for all their knowledge, all their records, all their reach, the Sumerians couldn't predict what came next. For nearly 2,000 years, Sumer was the beating heart of civilization, and then, in what feels like a blink, it was over. The date is well defined, 1739 BCE, since it's the latest clay tablets we could find. The city still stood, but they were no longer Sumerian. The language faded, the culture dissolved into Akkadian, then Babylonian, and the people who once ruled the rivers and canals were absorbed, forgotten, or gone. So what happened? According to online theorists, the explanation is cosmic, as it always is. Maybe the alien overlords used some weapon of mass destruction to cover up their gold mining gig and so on. But the truth is much more familiar and tragic. As most archaeologists believed at the time, the land itself turned against the Sumerians. After centuries of intensive farming and irrigation, they faced salinization. Their own state-of-the-art water systems gradually poisoned the soil with salt. Yields dropped. Crops failed. Meanwhile, climate shifts triggered droughts that turned once fertile land into dust. Add to that political fragmentation, rising conflict between city-states, and waves of invasions from Amorites and Akkadians, and you've got a collapse. Not a cataclysm, just the slow grind of environmental decay and human short-sightedness. They built the first great cities on Earth and then watched them dry up. And maybe that's the real warning. Civilizations rise with law and writing and fall with climate change and bitter neighbors. And after all the gods, the ziggurats, the star charts, and flood myths, here's how we really know the Sumerians were human. Because one of the latest surviving clay tablets in history is a complaint. It's from around 1750 BCE. A guy named Nani is furious. He ordered copper from a merchant named Ea Nasir. And when it arrived, junk. Not just junk. Low-quality junk, and Nani goes off. He rants about his servant being treated with disrespect. He demands a refund. He warns Ea Nasir that his business reputation is on the line. It is essentially the world's first Yelp review, and it is spicy. This is what makes the Sumerians so real. These were the same people who tracked Venus and mapped constellations, who invented cities and codified law, who may have watched the skies for meaning, but they also got bad customer service and made sure the entire world knew about it for the next 4,000 years, because in the end, they weren't myth, they were people with delivery problems, and with just enough pettiness to make a clay tablet last forever. Want more stories where real history is stranger than fiction? Subscribe and tell me in the comments, which ancient mystery do you think deserves a closer look?